Today we welcome as our guest speaker Mr. Paul Goodwin. And Paul is here to tell us the remarkable story of his father Gordon. Gordon was a boy from the Queensland bush who served with great distinction as navigator with Bomber Command in World War II. Very much against the odds, Gordon survived 65 sorties over enemy territory, including 32 in the notoriously perilous Pathfinder unit. Paul graduated in arts and law before finding his true vocation in marketing. For more than 20 years, he brought us familiar household products from well-known manufacturers such as Reckitt & Coleman, SC Johnson and Uncle Toby's. And he then moved on to more management-focused roles. Paul took up writing in retirement, and in 2020 his best-selling book, The Last Navigator, was published by Allen and Unwin. And he's now working on a personal memoir relating his experiences in the highly competitive world of marketing. Would you please welcome Paul?
I hope this works. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Gary, for inviting me today to this wonderful club of yours. You've got a fantastic membership here. And Roseville Chase Probus Club is very dear to my heart. I think I was involved many years ago, so when it first started. So it is a sort of a very fond memory for me. Gary, just to mention, he's a fellow writer as well. You're all aware that he's published a book. He's a good friend and an excellent lawn bowler. So I thought you should know all those things about him. Also, I'd just like to thank the past president, Umesh. Many have stories to tell, and I would encourage you. What I find this book does, it evokes a lot of memories of other people's parents, and I love to hear those stories, but also this book is really a celebration of what our parents actually did during World War II. So I'd encourage you to talk about your stories, and many have a story to tell. To start, my father was a proud Queenslander, and this is his story. So it's written in his voice, the book, and it's as a result of me talking to him, having many years obviously in discussion, but it's very much his story that I've tried to capture. So what I normally do is to get you in the mood, I'm going to read you a little bit from the book, just to set the scene, as it were. Facing an aircraft on fire at the end of the runway, flames erupting from the black mushroom clouds in burnt orange, you prepare to take off on your second attempt at crossing the Atlantic. 2,000 miles in a fuel-laden Lockheed Hudson on your way to war from training in Canada. Special tanks filled to the gunnels to make the distance. Your second operation in a Wellington bomber, and first time over enemy territory. Suddenly, out of the pitch black comes a strange and frightening blue shaft of light, picking your aircraft out of the sky. Coming by between 10 and 50 searchlights, locking on and lighting up the cockpit like daylight. You're surrounded by exploding flak, trying to blast you from the heavens with its tumultuous shattering sound. The skipper drops the bomber out of the night sky. You feel your plane ditching into the ice-cold waters of the English Channel, being the only survivor in a life raft tossing in the dark, roiling ocean, awaiting possible sea rescue in the dead of night. The choking, chest-tightening feeling of being trapped in a burning Lancaster, enduring the uncertainty, you count down the requisite 60 seconds for the tanks to blow. Your skipper's thrown off the fighters with yet another brilliant corkscrew manoeuvre. But will you get your badly wounded bomber home? The last nail-biting trip over Berlin, you briefly ponder how you managed to survive the last 8, attempting to bring the big city to its knees and end the war. You feel your chances for survival have moved to 0. These are but some of the memories of my father, Gordon Goodwin. a squadron leader with Bomber Command, and member of the Pathfinders, the Corps d'Elite, who led the way in virtually every major bombing operation for the last 3 years of the war in Europe. His ordeals would keep flooding back in his dreams at night, even into his 90s. War was my father's defining moment, releasing him from a mundane life and unpleasant childhood. So that's just a little bit at the start of the to sort of give you the feel. It's very important that we keep recognising what Bomber Command did. There are not many left now from Bomber Command. I think there were 12 alive in Sydney, and funnily enough, this book brings you amazing contacts. I met up with the brother of my godfather. My godfather was a marine artist, Dennis Adams, but this was Tony Adams, and he recently died. He was one of the last 12. So it's down to 11, and he died at 98. But it does bring you some amazing contacts, and as I said to you earlier, encouraging you to share your stories as well. My father completed his memoirs in 1997 when he was 80. But they were very sort of matter of fact and emotionless. You know, the guys in those days didn't talk too much about the war, and they felt it wasn't right to, you know, express emotion. It was all matter of fact, and his memoirs were very matter of fact. I wanted to get what it was really like. I wanted to get behind his story and talk with him about what it was really like. And I was very lucky. I retired, and he gave me a wonderful retirement project. And I had 5 good years with him, just talking with him and getting him to tell me, and I've got a bit of sound for you as well, but just tell me what it was really like. And he started to open up. Funnily enough, into his 90s, it was his most memorable experience, and he was able to recount in detail what he'd been through. And he kept reading the books as well, so it was something that stayed with him all his life. He had this amazing library. Here I was, I mean, what else could I do but help him, or help to write this book, because he had this extensive collection of books on Bomber Command. His skip, Philip Patrick, in number 7 Squadron, that they served together for many missions, many dangerous missions, kept sending him books. The latest book in England he'd send out with a little inscription on the front. So my father had this extensive library. I had interviews with him. I've got his flying logs, documents, a lifetime of conversations. I went to England and talked with Philip Patrick and heard what he went through. My mother also, she was a London girl, so they met in the war, and she actually wrote her own memoir and had many stories which are in the book about what she went through as a London girl. So it wasn't all the flyboys, the guys out there over enemy territory. The civilians had a horrendous experience as well, but I'll come to that. So my father didn't have an easy life. I mean, I count myself very lucky. I think our generation has been very fortunate, but he was forced to leave school by a fairly nasty sort of father, I have to say. At age 12, he was very bright. He had gone to Brisbane Boys College. They offered to give him a scholarship, and so the parents wouldn't have had to pay anything. But his father, who was an overseer in Fiji, and that gives you a flavour of the man, believed that my poor father should stay at home and tend the orange orchard. And he wasn't doing too much, but he was using my father as labour. So at age 12, he denied him a secondary education, basically. Would have been paid for. He was bright and clever and would have got a scholarship. No, he was forced to stay at home. So that was his father's sort of input. I like to recount a little story about the carpet snake, simply because it showed what he was able to do at a very young age, age 12. His father would send him off to get food. Now this was I guess during the Great Depression as well, when the price you could get for oranges was virtually zero. So they didn't have much money, and he was sent off to with a 22, not many bullets, and told to make everyone count, and he would bring back food for the family table. But he's coming back, he's been sent out. He stayed overnight as a 12-year-old, by the way. This was, nothing was thought of this. And he comes across this gigantic carpet snake. He told me this story, 15 feet, 8 inches, rears up over a log in the night as he's coming home on his last day, and he shoots it between the eyes from the hip with his 22, and then skins it, and he takes it home, and that was enough for fertiliser for I think a few months for the family orchard. The snake skin was worth a fortune, but he just showed how he was able to adapt. His uncle Stan saved him. Thank God he had. This was a generous, warm man who was the manager of the Bundaberg sugar mill, and he convinced my father's father, or my grandfather, to let him come to Bundaberg and to let him be trained as a sugar boiler. This happened in 1939 when he was 21. So he goes to Bundaberg, gets qualified as a sugar boiler, which probably helped in his technical skills. And he was trained also in the Vickers machine gun. You can see up the top there, this is a little thing of mine. I just love the way the Vickers, it was called plunging fire, so you couldn't actually aim direct, you had to use plunging fire, but he was trained in that, became a full sergeant in the 8th Division AIF, and I think a couple of months, he was sort of saved in a way, and I wouldn't be talking to you today if it wasn't for this, but he'd gone to the Empire Training Scheme 2 months earlier, but within 2 months the 8th Division AIF were sent to Singapore, and they of course were the ones who ended up in Changi, so not many came back. He ended up being accepted and trained as a navigator bomb aimer in Canada. Training in Canada was a wonderful experience for him. I won't go into all the detail, but I remember his description of the first flight in an Avro Anson in Sydney, where he had the initial training, actually in Linfield, over at Bradfield there. But he didn't get to fly, but his first flight in an Avro Anson, just describing what it was like to fly. For you imagine a Queensland boy hadn't been exposed to terribly much, what it was like going to Canada on a ship and then flying in an Avro Anson. He explained a nice little story, which I loved, about his training as in gunnery, because they were trained in all aspects. Although he was training as a navigator, he was up in a ferry battle, and he used to have to practice gunnery, and he explained that some clever skipper told him, just wait till there was a drogue being towed by the plane in front, which was your target. But it would turn, and he said, just wait till the plane turns and the drogue is suspended in midair, and then put all the bullets into the drogue, and that'll maximise your score. So he actually did that, but said that his skip almost had apoplexy because he nearly took the aircraft down as well. But so all those things, if you can imagine, these are very young men, and the fun they had, and there's a lot in the book about. I was slightly embarrassed to put it in because all the pranks they used to get up to, and they're quite senior. By the time he's doing all these pranks and things, he was, I think, a squadron leader, but they were still doing some very silly things. But it's all there because it was a big part of his memoir, and it was obviously important to him that they didn't take life too seriously. So it's sort of a bit of a record, I suppose. Getting across the Atlantic, he meets here a fellow called Bennett, who you may know of. He's an Australian, famous in the end for forming the Pathfinders, and he was the one who really got them into targeted how to really get bombs on targets. A very famous man, not well recognised, and also a Queenslander. But having completed his training, he then has to ferry across, and Bennett at this stage is in charge of Atlantic Ferry Command. And he's got to ferry across a Lockheed Hudson across the Atlantic. Now, we all just take airline travel for granted these days. You hop on the plane, it's safe, you know, not too many problems. In those days, even getting in an aircraft, getting across the Atlantic was, you know, pretty hard to do. And the weather patterns were horrendous for small aircraft. So this is a small aircraft, a Lockheed Hudson 9180. And they're up in the sky. He's, you know, the navigator with the crew to get this plane across to England to take part in the war. And one engine of the two fails and starts to misfire. And he's asked by the skip, do I turn around or do I keep on going? It's halfway, or just less than halfway. The target is actually Scotland from Labrador in Canada, and they get about halfway and he's got to decide the first question really. And so they turn around and they go back. And then they're waiting to sort of take off for the second run, and the engine gets fixed up. And these aircraft were filled to the gunnels. They were small aircraft, but to get across they had to fill the whole fuselage of the aircraft with petrol tanks. So the plane in front's about to take off, another Hudson, and of course it's too heavy and they don't make it off the ground and crash into the barrier in front, and the whole plane explodes. So now the crew gets out, thank God. But so this is second run at trying to get across the Atlantic. He sees this before them. They pause for 30 minutes while they clear the wreckage, and then they take off. Well, they only made it as far as Ireland. It just proved the headwinds and the impact of the weather in those days, but they only make it as far as Ireland and have to refuel. And essentially this is just shows the dangers in those days of just making it across the Atlantic and making it to war. That they fly on then to Scotland, and my father's into war. Just sort of briefly, forming a crew even in those days, they would assemble all the trained people in a room and basically say, form a crew yourselves. So they'd go around talking to each other and form a crew of 6. And it was sort of self-selection. There's a guy called Arthur Doubleday who ended up being quite, you know, a famous man as far as civil aviation is concerned in Australia, but Arthur was his skip. And obviously they form a great bond. They head off in a Vickers Wellington. It was a medium-sized bomber with what they call geodesic construction, which means it's sort of like a butyrate that's put over sort of canvas. So it was that was the first aircraft he's up in. They were the first Australian RAAF squadron, number 460 squadron. The descriptions, this again is what I was trying to get from my father. He explained to me what it was like on the first time. The first time they go, they have a problem with the engine, so they don't get over enemy territory. Second time, they get combed by searchlights, and suddenly out of the blue, well, there's a blue light comes up first, which is how they measured the height of the aircraft, and then the searchlights open up, and it's like daylight inside the cabin of the aircraft, and then the flak comes, and the sound of the flak. He said the light was bad enough, but the sheer sound of exploding flak around you, the sound was what was the most terrifying. So that's just sort of the start, I suppose. He then gets involved. You'll probably know of Butch Harris, who's you know, the guy who led Bomber Command, and he wanted to form plane groups of 1,000 bombers. And I think in May 42, the first 1,000 bomber raid is sort of sets off, and 18 are from 460 Squadron. But my father was sort of part of that.
When you went to the Ruhr, you had maximum exposure to searchlights. You were often coned in this particular blue light combination. anything up to 40 or 50 other searchlights, so that no matter what evasive action it took, it wasn't possible to get rid of the lights. Mostly the general technique was to sort of stall the aircraft and then to dive down through the lights, firing machine guns or dropping the odd bomb, whatever. But it was extremely difficult to do the sort of job you were expected to do in those circumstances. You were expected to fly over the target, to locate the target, and this was before pathfinders were evolved. At that particular time you were supposed to have identified the in one way or another.
So it's each individual aircraft.
But there were individual aircraft on their own against the particular target and the defences.
The odds were actually stacked against you. The statistics I'm sure you're all aware of, but alive and unhurt, less than 50% survived for more than 50 operations. So it was really touch and go, and I can't imagine myself living in an environment like that where each mission that you went on, you had a 1 in 2 chance of coming back. I just can't. My life is safe, predictable, all of that, but I just can't comprehend that. But that's what they faced, and they still went. There was a guy called Scrubber Scott in Sydney who trained my father and trained all the recruits in the early days, and his words to them, he was a World War I pilot, and he explained to them that the only way to survive war was to give up all hope. He told them at the very start, head out on every mission as if you're not going to come back. And once they'd done that, they almost put it to one side and could just get on with the job. But that's the advice that he was given. He had 65 missions over enemy territory, as Gary said, 32 with Pathfinders, and 9 to Berlin. And you can see there's a map which is in the book, which shows the number of missions to each of those locations that he went on. But I find that sort of fascinating. It gives you a visual feel as to the number of times they were out at high risk. Now the problem was with the early stages of the war in Bomber Command was that only 10% ever actually hit the target. They go to all this trouble, risk all this to go over enemy territory, but only 10% were ever getting on the target. And that's in a full tour of 31 operations. So can you imagine that's not having much of an impact on Hitler? They needed to change the game. And this guy called Bennett comes along, and he is appointed. He's a young guy. He rubs probably the brass up slightly the wrong way. Butch Harris sees the value in him, and he's got a magnificent record. There's a lot on Bennett in this book, so I'd encourage you to read that, because he's a man that should be recognised. I think he's one of probably the most successful people in World War II in terms of the impact he had on Hitler. But he develops the Pathfinders, and he uses, if you like, firework technology to basically say, we've got to send in the best of our flyers first, and we've got to get them to mark the target. So they would use red and green, if you like, to mark left or right of the target, and then the main force would be directed in. Now they'd assess whether they'd got the marking right and give them exact locations, but essentially he was able to lift it from 10% to 90%. So suddenly Pathfinders are, if you like, able to light up the targets and increase the success rate. Now what they're trying to do is knock out all the industrial development of Hitler. Germany had an advantage at the start of the war. They were well ahead of the Allies in terms of all the equipment and materials needed for war. So here you have, for the first time, they're starting to have a real impact. And this is where I think they do turn the tide of war, because not only are they affecting the production, but they're also, sort of preventing all the artillery and everything else from going to other fronts, and they're also preventing or getting all the fighters to have to come and protect the major industrial sites. So Bennett, I think, is someone who is really, he's an Australian Queenslander and someone who really needs to be recognised. I've got Philip Patrick. He's the man who sent my father all the books, but he was his skip in 7 Squadron. But he was an amazing pilot. I'll just quickly tell you that the reason he was so recognised, his first tour was with Stirlings, and they couldn't fly very high. So whenever the Stirlings were a squadron to be going on a mission, all the other crews would cheer because they knew that the Germans would be trying to shoot down the Stirlings. Now, he survived a full tour in Stirlings, and he was categorised as an exceptional pilot. But it wasn't just the pilot and the navigator who were critical. It was the gunners and the other members of the crew. If you had good gunners, they could scare off the fighters without them taking you down. Okay, this is a favourite of mine. I love the Lancaster. I have an affection for it. I don't know why, but it's just a delightful aircraft and could do the most amazing things. A pilot, they absolutely loved it. It was supposedly a heavy bomber, but they could manoeuvre them around the sky in an amazing fashion. You'll see in the bottom left there the corkscrew. Once a fighter comes in, it's the gunner's job to say corkscrew left or corkscrew right. As soon as the attack comes in, the skip knows that if the gunner calls it, he knows which way to go, and then gives the gunner a good shot at the fighter as it's coming in. But it was basically a corkscrew motion, diving and coming back up. You can see a diagram, an attempted diagram there, showing what they went through. But this happens in seconds. So fighter comes in, the skip dives the aircraft, and there weren't many fighters who could really follow them down. But it was a very successful manoeuvre that probably saved a lot of lives. A little bit about parachutes and the WAF, the WAF and all the ground crew. Don't forget all of those people who kept the aircraft in the sky. The ground crew you almost felt like, as my father said, it was you were borrowing the aircraft from the ground crew. They were so committed to the aircraft that they lovingly, kept it in very good nick. And so you're only really borrowing the aircraft for the mission from them. But with the WAF, they used to go to the WAF for parachutes, and this again is the wry sense of humour that used to occur, as my father told me, that they said, this is the WAF talking, if it doesn't work, just bring it back and we'll give you another one. But that was the sort of humour they had. I can't leave my mother out. That's my little mother, a London girl. They did get married. There was a lot of talk about marriage during the war. In the early stages, anyone who got married, they said, that you'll probably cop it, your mind's not on the job. Once they got through the war, they thought, life's not very long. The chances of me surviving 1 and 2 are not very good, so they just got married, which was magnificent. But my mother just explained to me she had 3 near-death experiences through the war herself. She was nearly shot by a German. She used to do secretarial work out in the country and was nearly, machine gunned by a German fighter that was just lost, I think. She then, there was a huge 4,000-pound bomb, and she was out and working for ICI, and the bomb came straight through next to her bed, went down to the kitchen, but failed to explode. So she's looking down from her bed to this gigantic bomb, which didn't go off. So, that's another one. The last one, which I was fascinated to find this. I've been to this place. This is where my grandparents lived in England, but That's Stewart Road, Wimbledon Park. And I found on the internet a picture of, and a V1 came over and destroyed that street. And this is August 44, which is when it happened. So my mother was upstairs and she was now working in London, but told by her father, who was an air raid warden, get down here fast, we've got to get into the Morrison shelter. Everyone else was in, but she was just thinking, oh, it'll be all right, nothing will happen. And he then yelled, because he could hear when a V1, the noise stopped, you knew it was coming straight down. And as an air raid warden, he knew this is where it was. So she then raced down the stairs, dived into the Morrison shelter, but failed to put the grill up because she didn't have time. And the bomb hit the street, and the whole place went up. The house was destroyed. They're down in the cellar, and they get them out. The only reason they could get them out is because the grill wasn't done. The grill, had the grill been up, it would have prevented them from getting out, and the whole building was fairly unstable. So it wasn't just the airmen; it was the civilians as well. So full credit to my mother. Shrage music. How are we going for time? Shrage music is something you should be aware of. This is where my father and his crew get slightly unstuck, because there's this new technique which they don't know about at this stage, where the Germans can bring in underneath a Lancaster a Junkers, and they have you can see them there, they're upward firing guns. And the idea was they'd be directed in at night by radar, and they'd come up underneath the Lancaster and try and shoot out the petrol tanks. And if they hit the tanks, you had 60 seconds to get out. And they knew that if they did that, the plane would just go down and all the crew would bail out. So, but they didn't know about this at this stage of the war. So they're on their way to Augsburg for a bombing operation in southern Germany, and there, suddenly out of nowhere, the plane is hit, and the gunners were so good, they wouldn't have missed an approaching aircraft, but of course they couldn't see anything coming from beneath them. So they're hit, and the plane goes up, and the two gunners bail out. They're very quick to escape. They know they've got not much time. And Philip does a corkscrew, which I've explained, and then nothing seems to happen, and they're sent back to, at this stage, the flame's on fire. These blue flames that my father described, they're trapped inside. There's a thing called window, which is, they used to throw out of the aircraft to throw off the radar. And it's like little metal strips, but it's in sort of piles, not piles, like bundles. Well, this wedge is in the escape hatch, so they can't get out. So they've really got no choice. So Philip says, go back and see what you can do. So they go back, they realise 60 seconds is gone, but it's the hydraulics that have gone up, and the whole of the side of the aircraft is sort of burnt out with blue flame and hydraulics, but they put it out. And then, of course, the whole Lancaster is disabled, and they've got to somehow get it back to England. And again, navigational skills, I haven't really mentioned those, but Navigator was the most critical part of Pathfinders, in that getting directly onto the target so you don't need to go back, it was terribly important. But getting the aircraft home was also absolutely critical at this stage, so they had to avoid all the danger points, and my father, with his navigational skills, helped him do that, and Philip kept the plane up. I don't know how he did it, but the plane wasn't in terribly good shape. So the two Jimmies survived, so that they found out later that they were taken captive, but they survived. And they make it home, and funnily enough, those photos up there, just out of interest, they're escape photos. They carried these, I couldn't work out why they were in civilian clothing, but they used to carry photos that made them look like civilians in case they went down and were taken prisoner of war and needed them to escape captivity. That's an aside. Black Thursday, it's just to try and give you the feeling of what it was really like and what risks they took. But Black Thursday is a very good example where there was a lot of fog and problems, and some of the weather people said you probably should cancel the mission, but they didn't. So they went off bombing Berlin, and essentially on Black Thursday, this mission, 12.2% of the aircraft were lost, 5.2% were shot down, and there were collisions with 7%, crashes or being abandoned. 294 people were killed, and there were 14 prisoners of war and 7 were interned. On this mission, they couldn't really see the target properly, so it was difficult. But on the return, that was where the main problem was. On the return, all their airfields were under fog, and they had this system where they burn off petrol on some of the major fields, but generally they were, if you like, having to land in fog. They had measurement techniques to finding out how high they were above the airfield as they tried to land. But essentially, if you can imagine, all these Lancasters were banked up at 500 feet intervals waiting to land. And as my father described it, they said, look, Berlin's a long way. And they'd had a lot of weather problems getting to and from, so they were very low on fuel, all the Lancasters. And so they have to make a decision. They're at the point where they know if they wait to land, they'll run out of fuel and they'll have to go off, and all the crew will bail out and they'll lose the Lancaster. So they go on to Marham, and the tower tells them to divert to Marham. So off they go to Marham, and they're looking desperately for the airfield, and there is a break in the cloud as described, and I think the two gunners see it, and Philip puts the aircraft down, but I think down to 50 feet he couldn't see what he was doing. He had to rely on the measurement, and actually the measurement was wrong, but with the skills that he had, such reactive skills, that he was able to survive this sort of difficult manoeuvre, just showing what a good pilot he was. So they finally make it onto ground, and thank God for that, we've survived. But of course, you've got all the other Lancasters coming in, and they can't see what they're doing. And they're just off the runway, and they're almost taken out, and a number of them were, by this other Lancaster who was desperate to land. So it was there were lots of collisions and problems, and the weather in these days, the weather was one of the big enemies, really, apart from the enemy themselves. Berlin, I'll quickly tell you, was very hard to take out. They were hoping to end the war by making it difficult in Berlin, that the general population would, basically say, we've had enough. But it was a very hard city. It was called the big city, a very hard city to take out, whereas other smaller cities were easier. But my father said after 9 missions there, he felt his chances of survival had moved to 0. That Berlin was so difficult, and there was such intense protection of it, that with the fighters, they now had radar on the fighters to find the Lancasters. They also had a thing called tame bore, where they would circle the route of return for the Lancasters. So he felt his chances of survival had moved to 0. Harris, who's in charge of Bomber Command, decides Berlin's too hard and they move to southern targets. But they did cost Hitler the war. I think by the work on Berlin and all the other major cities, they diverted so much from Hitler's defences that they cost him the war. That's Bomber Command. My father then moves to 635 Squadron, and he's having just been married, and this is another thing I find amazing. He's just been married, and he decides to take on another 12 operations, but he's flying with the inexperienced crews. So he's now a squadron leader, or he's been a squadron leader for a while, and in charge of navigation for 635 overall. But he just goes on missions as a supernumerary to help the inexperienced crews, less than 5 operations. If they could get through 5, then he would give them a much better chance of survival. So he, with his experience, went on these missions. Having just got married, he volunteered to go back to service and do these further 12 operations. Duisburg is one that we've both put in the book. It's a huge operation. It was bigger than Hamburg. I won't go into it now, but it was meant to stop the war, and it was a really successful operation. My father then does his 12 operations. They put him in charge of navigation as chief ground instructor for Pathfinders, and that's, as I say, navigation was the critical part of Pathfinders, because it was finding the target and marking the target effectively. Okay, so the medals and recognition, nothing's fair in this world, is it? I mean, we all have, there's injustice and all sorts of things going on, and this is an example for me back in the World War II days. My father gets the Distinguished Flying Medal from King George. He gets the Distinguished Service Order for his services to Pathfinders. But Churchill, in his victory speech, doesn't mention Bomber Command, and there's a service medal given to all the other services, but they don't give it to Bomber Command. And the reason my father surmises is that Churchill was trying to get re-elected after the war, and blanket bombing, area bombing was not considered, can I put it this way, kosher for at that time. And it's sort of funny, but so Churchill didn't mention it. He was obviously had his fallibilities, Churchill, but he just doesn't give them recognition. To the point that in 1980, both Bennett and Harris decide to mint themselves, 1980, a commemorative medal in recognition of all the service that the Bomber Command people had done, because after all they'd been through, 1 in 2 chance of living, no recognition is provided at all. This goes all the way to 2012. Can you believe this? That's the year my father died, by the way, at 94. The Bomber Command Memorial is finally created at Green Park by Queen Elizabeth in June 2012. And it wasn't until February 2013 that this service recognition, the Bomber Command clasp, is issued. And I applied posthumously for my father for the clasp, and I've got it. But that's in February 2013. So it just shows that, and I should probably go on just to quickly say that both Harris and Bennett, all the other commanders got, knighthoods, all sorts of things after the war. For some reason they were left out, and they made the biggest contribution. I think historically it's recognised they made the biggest contribution, but yet no recognition after the war, and no service class to recognise the service of Bomber Command. So if there's injustice in the world, which we all know there is, here's a very good example of it. My mother then comes to Australia, and there's some wonderful stories I won't go into, but you just bear in mind I go back, both my father's, well, my grandparents, but I never met my grandfather because my father wouldn't allow it, but my father's father and my father's mother weren't very nice people, I have to say, just that's the fact. And my father comes back to Australia, my mother comes back by ship, one of those ships that brings out the married of the war cruise, and he gets called away. He joins Qantas and he gets called away for an emergency where they're looking for someone they've lost. They never found it. And she has to be left with the parents up in Queensland. And of course, what do the parents do? They decide to take her mud crabbing. Can you imagine a London, fair-skinned London girl going out on the marshes looking for these things about this big, and you had to pull them out by their claw, and then they'd hand one to you to sort of hold while they got the next one. So my mother had to endure that, moths, mosquitoes. I won't describe what she went through, but just to survive meeting my father's parents, I think was an achievement. My father died in 2012, aged 94. My parents were inseparable, I have to say, and we couldn't persuade my mother to stay on, and she died 2 months later. But they had 40 years of happy retirement. My father was recognised in the New South Wales Parliament. I got a letter from Gladys Berejiklian, a most beautiful letter and with handwritten stuff, saying what an inspiration my father's time was. And this story obviously is recommended by Sir Angus Houston as well. So there's been a fair bit of recognition of my father's story to this point. He then goes on to Qantas and is recruited in 1945. He flies, I think he flew the second Lancastrian. They were called Lancastrians in those days as civilian aircraft. He flies the second Lancastrian out to Sydney to set up the International Qantas service. Well, he's the navigator. He then goes on to the flying boats, Constellations, Super Constellations and Boeing 707s, the jets. He had 26 years with Qantas. He was the chief navigator for 13 of those. And including his war service, he had a 30-year career and 13,700 hours in the air. He helped to introduce Doppler navigation and the inertial navigation system. And with the advent of the jumbo, where they didn't need navigators, in fact they made them obsolete, he helped with the computerisation to allow that to happen, so he would no longer be needed. So it's my sort of line, but I think, well, you know, I'm a bit of a marketing man, you've got to have a bit of a line, but I reckon he was, for major airline travel, the last navigator. Just to remind us, my father had a great love for flying, and there's Leonardo da Vinci. This is in the start of the book. For once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with your eyes turned skywards, for there you have been, and there you will long to return. So flying for him was an amazing experience and one that he really enjoyed. He also loved the bush and the outdoors in spite of his early childhood and what they did to him. He loved being out there. His profession of navigation was given to him by the war, so here he was a sugar boiler, no high school training, sugar boiler. The war gives him navigation. He becomes chief navigator of Qantas, stays with Qantas till 1971. So certainly the war gave him his legacy. He was a whimsical man. I should just tell you that I had some corporate marketing jobs and things. I won't be long yet. Corporate marketing jobs, and he used to say to me, I used to complain, you know, how difficult it was and that people were, you know, knifing me in the back and doing all sorts of things and how difficult he'd say, look, you think you've got troubles. He'd say, I have been through more than any of that, and I can tell you, don't take any of it too seriously. And he said that in his Qantas career as well. So having had a 1 in 2 chance in going out, and he had this whimsical turn of phrase where he could just make a joke, and I'd know he was lightening up the situation. But all these guys, once having been through what they'd been through, they just had this sort of wonderful sense of humour. So I'm going to just sort of finish, and this is his story. My father's profession had brought him an unforgettable panoply of the wonders of weather and nature as he faced his challenges in the air, seemingly skimming the surface of this spectacular globe out into the blue, puffed clouds abounding.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think you will agree, it is quite an amazing story. And how much do we take for granted today, things that our parents' generation did? I mean, to hear this story, to me, it's quite shocking, but it's also very reassuring. It's very rewarding, because so much of what we enjoy today is because of people like Paul's father who made the sacrifices. And we've heard a little snapshot of that story today. we've got time for just one or two quick questions if somebody would like to ask. Peter.
Right, Peter Lewis, fantastic talk, thank you.
Thank you,
So
Peter.
Bomber Harris got a lot of bad news after the war, a lot of criticism because of the carpet bombing, Dresden being a particular case. Now,
Yes.
I think that's very nice for people to think in retrospect how easy it must have been. Have you got any comments about those issues?
Well, this is my father's view. I am reflecting what my father thought, and he was fairly adamant about this. He said there are a lot of armchair experts after the war. In other words, looking back with analysis where you could have backed off a bit, you know, the last 10% of the war. But I think I remember about 1940, it was so bad after Dunkirk that there was almost talk of a treaty with Hitler. And it would have been horrendous for the Allies because they would have been under certain control. So it was touch and go right up until that point. And then Bomber Command comes in. My father compared it to, he said it's like a cancerous growth. If a surgeon does an operation and says, oh look, I got 93% of it, and I think I'll just leave the last 7%, it'll probably be all right, hopefully things will work out, you know. Well, you can't do that. War is just about, you've got to win and you've got to take it. And I don't think Hitler would have given in if he'd have got one chance of ever coming back, if they backed off and allowed him to rearm and to develop. They just couldn't stop the formula, and the formula was it affected civilians, I know, but read about Coventry, what happened in Coventry at the very start of the war in England. The only way to stop industrial production was to affect both the factory and the workers, and there was no choice. That was just war. And my father, he didn't like it, but he just said that's the way it had to be, and that was it.
I think we've run out of time. What I said, Paul's going to stay for a bite of lunch with us,
sure.
so please come to the table and have a chat to Paul if you've got further questions. So we'll wrap things up, and I think, as I said, it is quite amazing to think what our parents' generation did, and many of them, in many different ways, contributed to the sort of lifestyle and the benefits that we enjoy in our society today. And I think the thing that struck me when I read Paul's book was how damn difficult it was to know where the hell you were going when you're flying a bomber over pitch black Germany in the middle of a war, and how critical the role of Navigator was. And I think that's really, it shocked me, I have to say, that as Paul mentioned, to begin with, only 10% of the bombs hit their target. No wonder so much other damage was done collaterally. But the improvement from
To 90.
yeah, improved to 90 with the Pathfinders, in which Paul's dad Gordon was involved. So it's a great memory, and it's a great, I think, a great history to be recognised. And I'd like to say to Paul, thank you so very much for coming along and sharing this with us. And yes, if you're interested in a copy of his book, which I do recommend, he's got a few with him. So would you please thank Paul for his presentation. And here is a little bottle of jet fuel for you to take.
Thank you all very much.